Okay, well, good afternoon and welcome to the first Placemaking for Town Centres webinar in this series. I'm Jen Heal, Deputy Chief Executive of the Design Commission for Wales. This is the first of a series of webinars that we have organised, planned to happen monthly from now until February, focusing on different aspects of placemaking and regeneration in town centres. This forms part of the work that we've been doing in the Design Commission around support for placemaking plans alongside Welsh Government, but also part of our wider promotion and embedding of the Placemaking Wales Charter. So today we're looking at very much of that theme about embedding placemaking in local authorities so that it influences beyond any one department, which has been identified as a bit of a challenge when we've been talking to people about placemaking plans and about how, if a local authority is signed up to the charter, that can be taken forward. So that we're responding to that challenge, and hopefully we'll be providing some help with that. I'm going to start with a bit of an overview of placemaking and the Placemaking Wales Charter, just very briefly, and I'm sure some of you will have heard much of that before, but it's useful to make sure we're on the same page when we're talking about placemaking, what that means. I'm also joined by two other speakers today. So we've got Karen Whitney-Lang from the Regeneration Manager from Flintshire County Council, and Steve Smith, who's the Placemaking and Heritage Lead at Swansea Council. And they're going to be sharing their experience in their particular authorities of their journey so far on promoting placemaking within the organisations and what that looks like. We're very much not doing this as a how to do this process. Obviously, every place is different, every situation is different, every authority is different. But it is useful to share experiences. And so those presentations will talk you through what they've done in their authorities. But we'd like to hear from you too. Either in question or some feedback on what you've been doing. If you've got experience to share, it would be really great if you could do that. And you can do that, ideally, please do that through the Q&A function in this Teams webinar. So if you've got a question along the way, pop that in the Q&A, and we'll come to questions after all the speakers have spoken. This session is being recorded so that people who can't make it today can watch it back and gain that learning. We can circulate that at the end, and we can also circulate a copy of the slides. So I will make a start and just with a brief introduction to placemaking today. So as an overview, I'm going to be talking about what placemaking is. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Placemaking Wales Charter, and then a little bit about the local authority context. So what is placemaking? Well, there is no one thing that placemaking is. There is no one definition. It is a term that is used a lot. There is an argument to say that it's used too much and it's sort of everything to everyone. We want to ensure that's not the case, and it remains a meaningful term about how we create better places, so better physical places that are active and distinctive, but also that it becomes a way of doing things. So to get those better places, the way we do things needs to be thought about as well. So, we're thinking about those two main strands in terms of what we're talking about with placemaking. In planning policy terms, it's been embedded in planning policy at a national level for a number of years now, through Planning Policy Wales, which says that everyone engaged in the planning system should embrace the concept of placemaking. And back in the 2018 version of Planning Policy Wales, the document was reorganised really around placemaking, because one of the issues that we experienced when it comes to various policies and the various ways of doing things was that different topics different disciplines are working in different ways, separate from one another, and even the policies are sort of separated into these different sections. And even the way we plan places is sort of separating into different land uses, joined up by roads and parking. And this has an impact on the way we live and the quality of our lives. And as time's gone by, we realise there are some drawbacks to this way of doing things, and that segregating different uses and different people and different parts of our lives can sometimes lead to isolation, high car dependency, with particular health outcomes. And what we want to be doing with placemaking is thinking about all of these things together. So rather than thinking about things in terms of a topic, how do we think about them in terms of a place, and having that real place focus? So that's the idea really when it comes to placemaking from a strategic level, working down. And because the way we live our lives is not, clearly categorized into these different uses and these different zones. The way we live our lives is a bit more messy than that, and the places that we live in are a bit more messy than that and a bit more complex than that. Another thing we want to tackle through placemaking is placeless places, lack of distinctiveness, and I pick on these residential developments to illustrate that, but where are we in the world? What is distinctive about this place? What makes it special and distinctive and relevant to its place, as opposed to anywhere else? And active as well. I think if we're looking to create quality places, being able to walk, cycle, have interactions with people, to play, to wheel around places is really important. That's where we get a lot of value from the places that we live in, those interactions we have with people, those spaces to do things, spaces to come together. And so we need to think about how we can plan for places that allow this, plan for places that enable that activity in the public realm, and enable us to design the public realm in such a way that it fosters that type of interaction. Placemaking, though, is not just about strategic decisions, not just about big interventions. It can be very much about small interventions as well, and as much about bringing people on board through that process as it is about anything else. So reimagining spaces and places, working with communities is very much a part of that as well. As I mentioned, it's not one thing, and it's not done by one group of people, which I think is really important to the conversation today. That placemaking involves lots of different disciplines, people working in different areas and different departments, from your strategic planning and master planning down to the design of the spaces and the buildings, but also really importantly, community involvement, activities, street design, and what's happening at the local level as well. After Planning Policy Wales was reorganised to put placemaking at the heart of it, we worked with Welsh Government to develop the Placemaking Wales Partnership, which was made up of the organisations shown on the screen here. And we worked with a partnership to develop a little bit more around what placemaking is and what does it mean for these different organisations. And with that group of people, we developed the Placemaking Wales Charter and the Placemaking Wales Guide. And if you haven't seen these, please do have a look, and we'll drop a link to this in the chat as well, so you can access that. And the charter was made up of 6 principles, which, if you're signed up to the charter, you agree to promote those principles. Since we launched the charter in 2020, we now have over 150 signatories from a range of different disciplines, public and private sector, including local authorities. And I think an important part of today is understanding what that means for a local authority to be signed up to the charter. There's also a video explaining what the charter is about, but it has these 6 principles. These are the headlines, and they all contribute to our places. So the big questions like location and movement, about how you move people around, have a big impact on things like public realm. So I use this image to illustrate that. So what we see in the foreground here about people walking and cycling and chatting and having a coffee and, that pleasant public realm in the foreground is enabled by lots of big decisions about where development is located, how people move around so that this space isn't dominated by cars, what the mix of uses are, and how dense that development is. So all of those are really important strategic decisions. You'll notice at the first in the list and the top of this wheel is people and community. We are creating places for people and their involvement, their needs, the opportunities they bring a really important part of placemaking. We were really keen to ensure that was embedded in the charter and is worked out through the different ways in which the charter is employed. And that can look like lots of different things. Community engagement will be part of that. Empowering local groups to do things will be part of that. Providing places where people can come together will be part of that. Bringing the place to life. And our town centres are a really important aspect of that and the focus of these webinars. The placemaking guide we produced in 2020 was generally about placemaking. This one that followed was placemaking for town centres, and that very much looks at placemaking plans and what they are and how to do them, delving into a bit more detail about those. And we were really wanted to be clear that it wasn't just about producing a glossy document with a list of ideas, but about really understanding a place and its people and its opportunities and the full range of things that could happen in those town centres to bring life and activity and distinctiveness to them. So to conclude my bit, really, I think a lot of what we'll be talking about today is about joined up action. So not just about being one person's responsibility to do placemaking in a local authority. I think there's a need for a collective vision that brings together different departments as well as the private sector and third sector to bring about positive change in town centres, and that it's an ongoing process. It's not do it and placemaking's done. Our town centres are changing constantly, and so we need to be thinking about how to do placemaking constantly. And finally, if your organisation is not a signatory to the Charter, then please do look into that. It's a very easy process to sign up, and you'll find out more from the other speakers about what that means and how to take that forward. So I would encourage you to do that. So thank you for listening to my introduction. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to Karen. Karen is the Regeneration Director at Flintshire and we've engaged with her a few times around her placemaking plan and is going to share some helpful experience of what's gone behind that. So I'll pass you over to Karen now.
Thank you, Jen. Hopefully everyone can see the cover slide. And just to start, apologies if my voice goes at times. I've suffered with the lurgy over recent days, so I am now hopefully on the mend, but I may be needing a quick drink as I work through, so apologies for that. So as Jen's already introduced me, I lead the regeneration team within Flintshire County Council. Been in post since March 2022, which has absolutely flown by. For those of you that don't necessarily do much with Flintshire or know where we are, we're North East Wales, so it's really great to be flying the flag for North Wales today and to be asked to be a guest speaker. So my presentation is around sort of Flintshire and what we do. As Jen's already said, it's not necessarily how it should be done, it's how we've done it for the benefit of Flintshire and what Flintshire I think needs, and what's worked, what hasn't worked. So I'll take you through kind of the journey so far, if you like. Any questions, please use the Q&A, as Jen's already said. So in terms of my role, when I joined the authority, as I said, in March 2022, there was very much a task placed upon me to review a group that had met. And the group was called Place Group, but really was a collection of people within the authority that would come along and would listen to what regeneration colleagues were doing. And then they go, that's great. And then they go away, and then we see them again in 3 months' time. It's like, that's great. There was no interaction. And I think the point that Jen's just made really about it not being really one person within the organisation or just one team, i.e. regeneration, that was the sort of need and the driver for change as such. So I was tasked by the chief officer team within Flintshire to review what was working, what wasn't working, and to come up with how could we do this better in light of the guidance that was emerging at the time from DCFW, but also Welsh Government, and the requirement to have the placemaking plans for our towns. So in terms of establishing what's going on, how can we improve it, I set about individual interviews with officers across the authority that had been involved in the meetings previously, and tried to gauge from their perspective, how does that work? So what works well, what doesn't work so well? And I suppose from my perspective, I always think this, it was being brave, asking the questions that you didn't necessarily want to hear the answers to. Because obviously if it doesn't work well, then there's a big task ahead to change it. But I think the things I was trying to get underneath at that time, back in March, April and May in 2022 were, is this just a fair few within regeneration, or is this actually, a collaborative approach to looking at a place as a whole? And I'll move on a separate slide to talk about 7 towns that we're actually focusing on within Flintshire. So we're a county that comprises small market towns traditionally. So they're, the loss of big shops, big companies has long gone. Woolworths being present on the high street is still talked about, but as we all know, the changing face of our town centres, it's not like that anymore. So in terms of the people I interviewed, and going back to this review in the existing process, there were comments like, it's great to hear what Regen are doing, but it's not always that relevant, or we don't really get a chance to participate within that, or we don't really get a chance to tell you what we're doing and how that relates to the place. So in terms of reporting that back, it was packaged nicely, but it obviously was a bit of a blow for the chief officer team to hear that, people aren't really getting much out of this at the moment. And I proposed that we do things a little bit differently. So what I actually proposed was, and this is what we now have, 2 separate groups that would make up the overall governance and steer for our placemaking work within Flintshire. So a place group, which largely comprises people that are internal to the authority, senior managers, and I wanted nominated officers, so we could at least work with the same people initially on a consistent basis to try and work out how this works, and what does this mean for people? How can we be a bit more collaborative without working in silo? So that was all agreed at that point. I'll move on to the people and places group on a separate slide, so I won't say too much more at this point. But in terms of political involvement, there previously hadn't really been any engagement from our politician, who's our cabinet member, Councillor Dave Healy. And we were toyed with, should he be involved, should he not? Would that be off-putting to officers? Would they share information and their challenges? And actually we decided upon, and we still have, engagement from our cabinet member. And we wanted at that point as well, through the agreement of the chief officers, to make sure there were tangible projects that we were coming together to discuss, not just the work of the regeneration team, not just we've got some funding to deliver this particular project in Regen, but how can we work collaboratively on projects where, 3 or 4 aspects of the authority may be looking at doing some change within a place or investing within a place, and how can that be better coordinated? How could we become a team around the place, in effect? And so we created it, rather than let's update and just talk to each other about what we're doing, almost designing a development role together. So we're not just focusing on delivery, we're planning ahead, we're thinking about what funding is coming up, we're thinking about, well, if active travel works are on the street there and then we dig the roads up because the gas works are being done 4 months later, from a user's perspective, from a business perspective, that all does not make sense. How can we better kind of coordinate that? And that led to pretty much scoping out what we would do as a group in terms of reference and how we would interact with each other, and the frequency of meetings, which, as I said, is a minimum of 4 per annum. And although regeneration isn't the only team to be responsible for this, we have, for the time being, and for the foreseeable, I guess, accepted the role in coordinating that kind of function, the places and the people's group, which I'll move on the next slide to discuss in a bit more detail. So Team Flintshire, effectively, so our who's involved in making the place work as a whole, to invest in it, to develop it, to plan, design, implement, is largely three sort of cohorts, three groups of people. The place group I've touched on already, which is, as I said, senior officers from across the council, from different disciplines, that are largely as a day-to-day job focused on the place as their bread and butter. So regeneration, planning, street scene, highways, valuation, estates, assets, housing, and education, youth inclusion, as well as tourism destination management. So a range of, that's largely an internal group. But what we found along the lines of that, there was a desperate need and an actual real will on the ground for external representatives, external organisations and agencies to also come together to reflect the work of people. So not all projects sit in just places group or people's group, and we recognise that, but that's where they converge. So our people's group is actually the bigger of the groups. For flavour there on the right hand side of the slide as to the type of organisations we have involved. Again, we have quarterly meetings, but actually this work of the people's group, I would say, is constant. There's constant meetings outside of the quarterly meeting where people are interacting, discussing projects, development opportunities, collaboration opportunities, and then differently to the place group, it's supported by the council's staff that are more focused around sort of people services, as you'd expect, education, youth inclusion, community development, things like the homelessness team, team that support the gypsy traveller population, housing colleagues, housing needs team, social services. So really sort of focused on what are the issues and needs of people and how do we support them through the development and coming together for the, again, team around the people in this case. And the third element, which I think, it's not at the bottom to sort of dismiss that or say it's a lower rank proportion of our overall team Flintshire, but the local movers and shakers are totally underrated, I think, in terms of their impetus, their impact. We've run with some external funding secured a number of sort of grant schemes and activities, events schemes, those type of things. And this is where this particular group, in terms of the local delivery, really come into their own. They know what is needed to drive vibrancy within the towns, to create animation on the high street, to basically bring the high street forwards in its future. So they pull on the resource within both the place group and the people's group, but there's a really key role there as well within our kind of governance structure for Team Flintshire for involving those local movers and shakers, and they're really key to sort of helping us carve out the 7 town centre place making development plans that we're currently working through over a couple of year period in Flintshire. So in terms of then becoming operationally, how did we get people sort of starting to think about, oh, this is our job as well, it's not just the work of regeneration? So for the way we've approached the placemaking plan development in Flintshire, we've done quite a lot of the work ourselves, a very small team, so there's myself and five other officers. That in itself for 7 towns is a bit of a challenge because we don't even have an officer per town. Plus we're also delivering live projects with funding. That's our other part of our role. But I think the key to getting others involved is about making it everyone's business, sharing information. So when we've looked at data to inform our placemaking plans, we've looked at over 100 open and closed data sets, and that's yielded different sort of socioeconomic and different types of information. And if somebody's in planning, they may need that information. If somebody's making a decision around housing and the future housing needs, they have their housing stats. But how does that relate to the wider picture? So actually having access to our placemaking information and making that everyone's information, not just information that's held by the regeneration team, I really feel that's helped to involve people and then engage, which is the point I'll move on to. We've also used an online platform to engage people in Flintshire, and as part of our journey, that's really helped, again, Team Flintshire kind of find its feet, because what that has given us is public consultation feedback that we've then shared across the stakeholders, whether that's internal portfolios or it's with our external partners, for them to see how they can use that data as well. And our project ideas, the way we draft plans, the way we discuss timeframes for our projects and funding that's available to us, we share that information. So it's not necessarily, again, we're all doing that in silo of each other. We use the place and people's group meetings to kind of share that level of information and forward plan. In terms of engagement, that for me is really key, and we're at a crossroads at the moment with where we've been involving strategic personnel, the decision makers within the organisations, to actually now our plan is to have 7 frameworks and strategies, but we do want a live annual action plan for each of our towns as well. And in order to make that deliverable and to get to the implementation phase, we're now looking at reviewing the structure that we have that has, we think, worked, been relatively successful, but we're at that position now where maybe more operational staff may need to be involved in sort of the implementation side. So it's getting the decision makers right, the right people involved, and trying different methods. We've not been afraid to say, oh, we'll do that, see if it works. And I think actually, Jen, in a previous meeting, that's something that you've sort of encouraged as part of the placemaking plan development process, whereby it's not a linear process where it's like, just do that, get the plan done. That's what the plan looks like. There may be some time and periods where actually piloting things, trying different approaches is kind of part and parcel of that. And it's about, for me in Flintshire, when I reflect back on the last sort of 2 years and 2 years plus, what have we done? Why is it kind of glued and started to work? And I think it's around taking the time, not just to invest with people that come to the meetings and give them a chance to participate and engage, but it's also around fostering those positive working relationships outside of those meetings, and also not being afraid to introduce the consultants to the staff as well, and vice versa. They shouldn't be kept separate, because we're all about, you know, creating something for the benefit of the place as a whole. And then participation was the key thing that going back to when I first started in post and reviewed the placemaking kind of approach, or I wouldn't say lack of, because it was there, but just perhaps not as effective as it could have been. People weren't participating, and it was, you know, I don't know about you, but if you go along to a meeting where you expect to participate and then there's not much opportunity, then that's potentially frustrating. So what we do is I think Charlotte, actually my colleague who supports me directly with this work, she's on the call today, so she could probably do a better job than me going through this particular bit, because she's really helps in terms of every meeting we have. We refresh the agenda, we move things up and down. Instead of putting people last to give an update on what they're working on, we'll go, right, that was mid agenda last time, we'll put it top of the agenda this time, and keeping the agendas fresh and making sure that there's that opportunity for people to engage and participate is really key to what we've been doing. And just ensuring that people do think about how we're delivering things, how we align our resources. And as I said earlier, it's just making sure, in our case, it works for Flintshire at the moment to have a consistent lead and facilitation role, which is my team. But that said, once we got to delivery phase, it could be that sits, you know, with other people to take forward some of the meetings or the subgroups. And the subgroups work really well in Flintshire. We've got a targeted green infrastructure group that's amazing in terms of bringing people together and really looking at planned alignment of works and investment in the future. It's my main last slide, so hopefully I'm within sort of 1 minute. Yeah, thank you, Jen. Just in terms of, as Jen said, there's no right way of doing this, and this is to date how we felt our way and how we've kind of achieved things and had some successes, also some challenges. All of us are suffering with limited resources, and I think it goes without saying really that any of us, if we were asked to give a guest speech today, would say, oh right, it's about managing expectations with the funding we've got, the staff resources we've got. But one thing that we're really embracing at the moment is I've recently been approached by a couple of other local authorities who are keen to collaborate with us and maybe share what we're doing, what they're doing, and look at how we could align things. So that's there is power in people working together, I guess, is what I'm saying there. In terms of achieving buy-in, and the next couple of points, there's 3 or 4 key things that we're kind of focusing on at the moment within Flintshire. So we're looking at bringing forward, I think I mentioned this in an All Wales meeting we had maybe a month, 6 weeks ago. We're looking at an animation development to look at how we can best cascade information both within our own organisation to tell people what placemaking is and to seek to challenge their thinking really about, you know, how might that fit within my day job. Yes, I might work on the front desk of a reception area of the council, but that's all part and parcel of potentially, you know, the bigger picture. And so we're going to be in hopefully the coming months delivering that, rolling that out, but also for the external stakeholders that sit on the people's group. And also, you know, organisations like our town councils, we really do want people to understand what we mean in Flintshire by placemaking. What does Team Flintshire collectively look like, and what we're all contributing to? So that's one of our current projects. We're also not afraid to evolve. So I've already mentioned, you know, that kind of crossroads we're at with regards to, is it a strategic kind of attendee, or is it more of an operational resource now that we're looking at? We're constantly mixing meetings up, but at the moment there's still quite a lot of focus on relationships, nurturing and growing. What you put in is what you get out. I'm a firm believer in that. Excuse me. And then also the impact. So we're currently looking to roll out the livery, the branding of our Placemaking in Flintshire logo. We're having a website developed currently. So you can see that just at the bottom of the slide. Excuse me. And that's something that, again, we're doing not just within the council, but with all our stakeholders as well. That's something that, you know, people are keen to do. We'll be having a website that can host information about what's going on, for example, around placemaking within the NHS Trust, the work we're doing collaboratively with the police, some of the other initiatives that will all be held centrally within the Placemaking in Flintshire website. And also is a big focus at the moment about celebrating success, and what we are doing with the funding and the limited resources that we've got to kind of celebrate that in the press, LinkedIn, and various other ways. And we're really, really pleased to be featured as part of one of the placemaking DCFW case studies quite early on around just our approach in Flintshire. It's the type of thing that we're kind of celebrating and flying the flag for currently. And that's it from me. That's the journey so far in Flintshire. Lots to do still. By no means the polished article, and we'll just keep evolving and hoping, you know, that we can still get lots out of this kind of collaborative working in partnership approach. Final slide, I can't seem to scroll down on, but it's just my contact details. And I know, Jen, you're hoping to share the slides anyway after today's session. Yes,
yeah.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Karen. Well done for battling through COVID coughs, but you held out right to the end there, so that's great. Yeah, lots of food for thought there in terms of how to bring those right people together in the right way to get people aligned and around placemaking activities. So that's really helpful. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass over to Steve now, but just a reminder, I've seen a question pop in the chat. That's great. So do keep the questions coming through, and we'll get to those at the end. So Steve, placemaking and conservation at Swansea, talking to us about your journey over there. So I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Karen. So yes, we're talking about the experience in Swansea of all the sort of work we're doing here. I'm team leader for placemaking and heritage, which in old speak would have been urban design and conservation. So I head up a small team with a very wide remit. We work across the council, acting effectively as advisors and critical friends, primarily to the development management planning system and the physical and economic regeneration teams, working with transportation as well, cultural services. So we get to sort of talk to everyone, and we've been doing this for a good old time. I've been in Swansea for over 15 years, so certainly seen this culture change coming through. So briefly a bit about Swansea, because it's always kind of it's a learning process, and we've been doing a lot of things and learning and reflecting, and that's one of the key things about placemaking, is becoming a reflective practitioner. So it's not just about churning out processes or just keeping up with, you know, work streams. Actually, what are you actually doing, and why are you doing it? So in Swansea, as everybody I'm sure knows, we are a post-industrial city, which brings certain challenges and opportunities. We are very much a city of towns and neighbourhoods. We've got quite a big kind of contiguous urban conurbation that joins together, but there's distinct towns within that with very distinct different identities. The difference between Morriston and Gossynon and various areas in the city centre are very distinctly different. And it's acknowledging that that was a key part of the Victorian city, and it's something to build on or to bring back as part of the regeneration, to acknowledge and that sort of uniqueness and difference, but also interconnectivity. We're building a lot of regeneration programs, not just city centre, it's these towns as well are important. We've got very strong council leadership, especially around regeneration, council leading by example. On the screen there, you've got the new arena that we opened, I think, a year or so back. Fantastic new venue there, bringing a huge amount of regional culture into Swansea that wouldn't, acts and brands and various performers that wouldn't have typically come to Swansea, but also an amazing new coastal parkland that's totally free just to wander around. I think the first new park since Edwardian times in the city, which is actually on top of a 2-story car park. So again, very innovative ways of thinking, bringing the sea, bringing the coast into the city. And a lot of what we do all sits in one directorate, the place directorate. So we've already got a lot of these conversations going between offices, and also with one director overseeing all this. Sorry, moving on. So these are some of the things, the sort of scale of projects we've been working on, learning from them. I've mentioned the arena, mentioned the coastal parkland. We do a lot of listed building regeneration projects funded by Welsh Government and council projects and fundings there. We've been a lot of work repurposing our high street in Swansea with an urban village, which is a mixed use development. We're very kind of familiar with some of the challenges about repurposing vacant buildings and what that means, what it means to actually reuse upper floors positively. We've got we've still got the tallest building in Wales for the time being, and some of the challenges that brings about town planning, visual impact, and also just some of the considerations now post Grenfell Tower, which are having to be looked at with these taller structures. We've also got some large-scale new residential developments, the sort of greenfield developments that we all have across Wales. For the housing allocations, these are new places in their own right. People will live their lives in these areas. We need to think about, as Jen mentioned, the concerns about connectivity and making sure we don't have isolation. We don't really want to have future regeneration programs trying to sort out all these current developments that are being delivered. So we need to get it right now. A lot of work public realm green infrastructure. We have a lot of place-led LDP policies. We're embedding what we want to do into our policy framework. We also supplement that with placemaking SPGs. We've been doing a lot of town regeneration, which predated placemaking plans, as many of you on this call have already been doing this for years. Where there's been a lot of regeneration funding in Wales, and we've been learning, refining, and a lot of these regeneration plans are coming back to towns. Every 5-10 years we come back and see what's worked and maybe what hasn't worked. We have conservation areas, which is more than just the heritage protection and preservation. It's actually recognised in a lot of our town centres are conservation areas, and they also need regeneration. We did a lot of work with master planning, individual grand design houses, shop fronts, and right down, if you really want to get into listed buildings, into door handles, some of those really small features, and getting everything right at all scales. So these are the different ways effectively that you can do placemaking. There's various kind of different tools in the box that we're working with here, isn't it? And this is the same across all councils. There's the direct action. So what are those probably the typically big projects that councils are leading on delivering? I've mentioned the Swansea Arena. Other councils will have other key projects they're looking to deliver directly as key council projects. That's a chance to show that public sector leadership, how you're fully delivering placemaking in its fullest way, future generations, everything comes into those key projects. Then there's the funding support, which might be council funding, it might be transforming towns funding from Welsh Government. How are you helping supporting projects, the grants and the town centre loans? How are you guiding projects? What requirements are you placing on projects, which you can do for that? And then what are you doing in terms of setting frameworks as kind of leadership there? But what are you writing into your LDP and your planning guidance? What are you setting up as effectively the rules and the standards, if you want to call it that you're expecting of placemaking, accepting that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach? And then what are you doing day to day against that policy guidance framework? What development management? What are the planning officers' decisions? What are they making? How are they bringing placemaking in? So there's a range of different ways to do it. With some of it's proactive, some of it's reactive, but ultimately the key message there is placemaking applies at all scales in all places. It's not just for those big major projects where there's money available. Everything should be looked at through this lens of placemaking, because ultimately we know many of us live and work in Victorian towns. And it's quite simply the fact that places outlast people. So, and if we get it wrong, it can have major implications. And that's why the importance of getting it right. It's clear, but planning did lose its way in the 1960s, where there was the separation of people and cars and land use zoning and the post-war reconstruction and those sort of times. And a lot of what we're seeking to do now, I think, from our regeneration placemaking activities is kind of resolve where planning went wrong before. And ultimately, a lot of it worked in Victorian times, which was pre-cars, i.e. mass either active travel or public transport, people moving around, higher densities, mixed uses, and it's kind of looking back to what worked but bringing it up to date. But we're only ever custodians for our places, for our buildings, and the planning process and regeneration process is a very privileged role to be in, guiding and shaping places that will outlive all of us. So just move that box across. Okay, and then it's about understanding places. So ultimately, it's important to understand the structured place. It's a structured way of looking at places. Whilst every place is unique, there's a fairly structured way of looking at them, starting with the macro, the sort of big strategic items, moving down to the smaller micro, sort of the smaller things. And typically, when you look at a place, you can look at it under sort of three key criteria: the uses, the buildings, the public realm. The image on the right there isn't in Wales at all. It's actually in the North Lanes in Brighton, and I specifically picked that because when you look at the bones of that place, the physical environment, it's not that dissimilar to a lot of our Welsh high streets, town centres. There's fairly plain buildings there. There's a little bit of colour, but ultimately they're rendered buildings. There's the public realm. Okay, there's some blocks there, but nothing special on the floor there. It's the vibrancy that comes from the activity on Fridays and Saturdays and weekends. This street is completely full of people. You can't even see what the surfaces are on the ground there. So it's the uses often that sort of drive our places, which is where a lot of the regeneration comes in. It's supporting, sustaining existing uses, get that vibrancy going, and then the kind of the buildings bring their own character from that. Whereas conversely, if you haven't got the uses, no matter how much money you spend on buildings or public realm, you're always going to be wondering, why isn't it working? It's fundamentally what's going on in those buildings on the ground floor. It's always good to ask yourself, why would you want to visit or live there? So take that step back, because the local knowledge is really critical, the embedded knowledge, those years and years of awareness of what works, what doesn't work, but also first impressions. Sometimes we can get too close to a place maybe, and it's taking that step back and it's asking that question, well, why aren't people visiting, or why aren't people choosing to move or invest in an area? And you maybe need to look outside the area for some of that inputs. And that question about, well, we all love to visit certain places. How can we help to shape the places we're helping to guide and regenerate to be those places that people want to visit? A few kind of placemaking reflections and maybe a few myths or some of the statements you might hear, and just a few sort of responses there. So, first one, placemaking is a standardized approach. That's not correct, and that's where planning's gone wrong. It's trying to treat all places the same with planning standards, transportation standards, those sorts of things. All places are different, but we can use a standardized approach to understanding them, which is the placemaking charter principles, which help us then come up with an understanding that leads to bespoke, considered, responses. The next one in the middle there, placemaking subjective. That's often been said about design. Design's subjective. It's not a consideration. It's just it's your personal view over somebody else's. That's incorrect. Placemaking is categorical. So the example I've given there's a wrong way and a right way to face buildings. A lot of places went wrong by backing buildings onto streets in the past, or backing buildings onto roads, and then we've got all these sort of problems about fronts and backs, and what's an active frontage and what's a dead frontage, and where's a fence, and all those sorts of things. So facing buildings around the right way is a clear example of how you need to get it right. Otherwise, it's clearly a failure. But once you start to get into aesthetics and appearance, then it does depend on individuals, cultures, experiences, your background, how you react to different places at different times. So that's interesting to understand those different perspectives, but there's some fundamentals to get right there. And the one on the right there is this whole point about this whole sort of gap between we like visiting certain places, whether that being the UK or overseas, but the places we're funding and helping to shape through the planning process, they're so different. There's this gap. Why aren't we kind of creating places we actually want to visit? And it's understanding that uniqueness and challenging that standardized approach that's made everywhere feel the same a lot of the time. And a lot of the kind of process about getting this placemaking approach together, as we've heard, is about being holistic, sharing a vision, and it's through that senior management leadership, whether that be at the political level or its director level, coming down into sort of the officer and management levels, is giving people that time and space for physical and online collaboration. So getting around, it used to be in the past, you'd have chats with people in the corridor, which obviously doesn't happen as much now. So creating new ways, whether it's regular meetings, which is what we do in Swansea, it's just we've got very formal structured regeneration board meetings, and then more informal officer working groups where we just are able to have that open forum and just chat about things, find out what's going on, join things up. And if we don't think things are quite right, there's these different ways of working around them. So it's building those links. It's also identifying those key players both within your organizations and externally. So there will often be a consistent group of developers operating in an area. It's understanding them. Often a lot of developers these days do have corporate, social, environmental plans. And I've certainly seen that change over the last 15 years, where we had to really sort of push hard to get certain things into certain projects, like green infrastructure, or just about getting the right approach to which way to buildings face. I remember a lot of battles around those, let's call it. But nowadays developers are coming with much better scheme from the very first moment, because they know what their organization wants to achieve, and they know what ultimately what they, if you want to call them, their customers, the people who are going to live or buy work in their buildings, what they're expecting. So it has changed, and it's a much better place. Housing associations are key, both in terms of the services they provide for communities and in terms of their development agendas, and they're often leading and innovators in those ways. And the education sectors, the colleges, the universities, they're critical in terms of this process, but also just generally that is the heart of communities outside of town centres. The schools, they are the places where a lot of people interact, and you can sort of see how communities form around those school gates, and recognising that how these things, planning plays a key role in day-to-day life. And then, if you've got your joining up going on, you are breaking down silos. So you've got that understanding of how your departmental structures work. Most authorities, you would hope these days, have got the functions around place in one directorate. So transportation would sit, you would hope, in the same directorate as planning and regeneration. So you've all got that shared vision. You also, if you are going to start having these internal discussions with colleagues, where you're not sure if you are on the same page as a shared approach, is actually challenging with evidence. So often there might be a different view, but it's roundabouts, for example, might come up as we still maybe have transportation roundabouts proposals in certain projects, but there's clear evidence, starting with Manual for Streets, which has planning status through TAN 18, that roundabouts aren't good for active travel, walking, cycling. So there's ways of saying this doesn't work. This is the evidence sitting at the national level or from external organizations. How can we do things differently? And sometimes you learn collectively as to what does or doesn't work. There's some interesting sort of projects going on around shared spaces. Shared spaces for all abilities can be designed using a range of materials. You don't have to use high quality natural stone. There's ways of doing it with different tarmac materials, for example. So that's a bit of the journey we've been on in Swansea to get the same outcomes without the cost management implications there. And sometimes if things aren't working, obviously that's where the senior leadership comes in, and you would hope that there's routes to escalate and take balanced views, and listen to the council, to the management, as to which direction certain things are going to go when maybe it isn't quite as balanced there. And if you're really not sure and you really want some external help, obviously run this call today with Design Commission for Wales. It's always great to bring in the external impartial advice outside of organisations. So, and a lot of it's about this change of approach, change of philosophy. In the past, planning and maybe regeneration has been very focused on the process. So the number of planning applications processed in a certain time, in terms of the speed, the amount of spend, regeneration spend in a certain quartile. So, this whole thing about development management decisions, they might be quick decisions, but are they good decisions? It's changing this planning philosophy of, is a planning application bad enough to refuse, or is it actually good enough to approve? There's a very significant difference there about what you're looking at in terms of the proposals before you're there. And the same thing to regeneration funding. Are you spending the money in the quartiles and in the third quarter? Are you getting the money out the door? But actually, what are you actually spending that money on? What projects are you supporting? Is it actually making that right difference when you come back and look at it as well? So you've got to come back and have a post-completion review, and ultimately, it's not losing sight in the whole thing. Everything we do in our jobs it's about people and places. So it's not about those processes. Placemaking plans is a bit there to think about. Obviously, we've heard every place is different. Every place has different challenges and opportunities, which means the placemaking plans will all be different. There is no one size fits all. Placemaking charter, we've heard about that. Again, I've emphasized there, those first impressions are important. So that's what's interesting. If you do get external consultants or external bodies to have a look at these areas, that gives you a different view maybe to that local grassroots view. And your placemaking plans will come up with all sorts of different interventions at different scales and different times, both in terms of short-term quick wins, but also how places differ between daytime and nighttime as well. There's also different ways of looking at our places. We've been testing this out for quite a few years in Swansea. The image on the screen there is Woodfield Street in Morriston, which has got a Grade 1 listed chapel, but also an area that we identified through conservation area appraisal needed far more than just heritage control. It actually needed full regeneration support, and gradually we're building a program here, which is my understanding is gradually help influence and sort of shape the national placemaking plan and transforming towns program by kind of testing and developing it in Woodfield Street in Swansea. And a lot of what's going on isn't what you actually see physically in that screen there. It's that business support, the small grassroots helping sustain an existing building, or helping an existing business to be sustained, or helping to start up a new business in a vacant unit. And the key thing that we've learned from that is linking planning and regeneration funding. So we know what projects are asking for funding. We know where the gaps are, maybe who isn't asking for funding, or which buildings aren't potentially looking for funding at present, and maybe to help to prioritize and focus action, but also making sure that projects that are coming through the funding regime are going to be acceptable for planning. So we don't want to have one of these situations where a project's got funding support and then there's planning concerns. Should we join that up effectively with an internal pre-application? And there is also scope within the funding agreements under the Transforming Towns, those sorts of things, to actually put some specific requirements in. If you feel that there's certain placemaking outputs that you're looking for there, you can write them into the funding agreements above and beyond what would be planning control. Planning system as well in terms of placemaking. We've all got an overarching LDP policy about placemaking, which would have been in the back in the 5-10 years ago would have been the overarching generic design or urban design policy. So every council's got a policy to work with. We've all got reference to Future Wales, which is also part of the development plan. And where necessary, I would strongly advise supplementing those policies with placemaking SPG. So on the screen there, we've got our residential design guide for Swansea, which sets out our stall for developers against 12 criteria, starting from the sort of the macro, the strategic aspects of neighbourhoods, right down through to detail about the character of the places. And developers know what's expected in Swansea, and they come to the table for negotiations knowing they have to start off at a certain level. So it's certainty, and it gives us a sound basis to run those negotiations from. It's always important to do this prior to application where there's time and space to negotiate. So using those pre-application services, the time there, but also not losing sight of the place overall. So using planning conditions, getting those materials right, and also planning is making sure you go back and review it once it's complete, not after the 5th house, probably once there's a decent quantum of people living there. You can see, is it really working as a place? Is it achieving what planning hoped it would be? And learning the lessons.
One more minute, Steve, because we've got lots of questions coming in.
Okay,
that's all right.
Skills and resources. An interesting question, maybe this will come up in the chat, is how many councils in Wales do have recognised placemaking officers? I know not every council does have. I certainly think there's more, my understanding is there's more councils in England with recognised placemaking officers. So there's interesting questions there as to how things vary across the different regions of the UK. We know from experience in Swansea, certainly, we have been successful in recruiting 2 specialist officers, but it is very, very challenging to get people into Wales from England. There seems to be some certain barriers there. So are there other ways of bringing in specialists in a regional basis? I know there's been talking about regional collaboration. Does it work for placemaking? It'd be interesting to hear who's doing this across boundaries. And other ways of thinking about this is the pipeline of future skills, future placemakers. So universities, we've got some great universities in Wales and higher education establishments. A lot of them are offering placemaking related courses and qualifications. And how can we support the young people on those courses to give them those best experiences, whether it's being live projects they can work alongside us on, or whether it could be placements, which is obviously interesting and challenging given that a lot of us are working flexibly. I've talked about most of that. It's about organizational culture. So it's more than just having one officer or having somebody placemaking in a job title. It needs to be part of your organizational culture right through from the cabinet holders. Hopefully we've all got directors of place these days. Chief planners need to understand how they, the resources are required. It's about empowering officers. We've talked about placemaking charter, peer support outside your organisation, quite useful there. Obviously, there's Design Commission for Wales. There's also a POSU, which is Planning Officer Society for Wales. There's a placemaking group, which is primarily development management officers at the moment, but it could be, I'm certain it could be expanded to include regeneration officers. And there's also externally, nationally, there's the Urban Design Group, which does a useful range of seminars and talks and publications as well, quite easy to find online. Last slide, in terms of some takeaways just from this, it's about shifting that mindset from outcomes, away from outcomes to outcomes away from processes. So what are you actually doing and why for people and place? Creating that time and space. You can't do this if you're under pressure to just hit deadlines and churn work through. You've got to be able to step back sometimes, and that's where the importance of that political and senior management leadership comes in, is to empower officers, give them that remit to really focus on placemaking. But at the officer level, because obviously that's more senior and that's a bit sort of takes a bit longer to bring in sometimes, what could you do? And I would say from experience is becoming a reflective practitioner. So what I mean by that is actually what are you doing and why, and what's the best impact you can make with the scope and the tools and the current remit that you've got. And the fundamental thing maybe is to think after this call, and when you go back to your desks this afternoon, is what would you actually change tomorrow? What would you change here and now? What could you just do differently? Just trying to bring a more focus on placemaking to your practice. There you go. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you so much, Steve. So much content in there, lots of really helpful perspectives, and thank you for sharing Swansea's experience. And yeah, the way in which placemaking isn't, not just one person's consideration, but it's, like you say, how you structure departments, policies, procedures, all those sorts of things fall into that. We've got lots of questions, and I'm conscious that not a lot of time, so we'll keep going run over by about 5 minutes if that's okay, and then any that we don't get to, we'll follow up in a different way. As I say, this is the start of a series, so if there are things that are coming up, please do get back to us and we'll address them in the next one. So the first one that came in was about avoiding it's important to avoid top-down planning, but people can also become easily over-consulted and frustrated if they don't see results in good time. How do you find a balance? And I think that's something that comes up a lot, to sort of the consultation fatigue, but it's important to get their involvement. Karen, did you want to briefly come in on that one?
Yeah, in terms of the digital consultation that I mentioned, we've actually, I think, reinvigorated consultation and got rid of that lethargy that can come with it through traditional methods. So going out into community centres with a clipboard, asking questions. We have done some in-person consultation, but it's not people's preference these days. So we've gone around quite an innovative, interactive way of engaging through an online platform and paying for social media driven campaigns, which we know is more aligned these days to those that are, obviously digitally literate. It doesn't include all walks of life, we get that, but our response rates are significant compared to traditional methods. So I think it's coming up with something that actually meets the needs of people and how they want to be consulted. We've always got to carry on, under the Future Generation for Wales Act, etc., fulfilling the needs of asking people what their thoughts are, and their feedback, their perceptions, to inform our plans and our work. But I think it's doing it in a meaningful way that's maybe a bit more fun, colourful, interactive than the traditional methods that certainly local authorities are tending to do. So I'll Give My View platform that we've used has really kind of propelled that, and we're seeing the opposite, actually, more people engaging than ever rather than not. And we're now kind of being used as best practice within our own organisation, where some of the other teams and services we've got the license now for that software that we've purchased from the provider, and other aspects of our organisation are also seeing the success that we've had for the placemaking work, and they're also trialling the use of that for other things. So
great.
Yeah, just booking the trend, I suppose, just finding new ways that people kind of align with, that they're interested in.
Yeah, great, thank you. One of the things that we talk about around this is that testing of ideas, and sort of obviously big projects take a long time to develop, and therefore people maybe get a little bit disillusioned. Steve, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that. And obviously testing ideas requires an element of a culture that's willing to try things and give things a go. Steve, do you want to say anything about that and what that takes internally to get to a position where those things can be done?
Yeah, thanks, Jake. Yeah, I think it's ultimately about getting to a point where you've got kind of departmental alignment to a can-do culture that you so but rather than ending up with a list of reasons of why something can't happen, of actually saying, well, these are there's some barriers, there's some challenge to overcome, but this is what we could do. Often, the small pop-up green spaces, parklets, is a prime example of how you can change a small parking space into a green space or a sitting area or something, and how many different council departments you need to get aligned in order to do that is interesting and challenging, but shows a stepping stone prior to a big public realm scheme, for example. The other thing that's interesting is sometimes a lot of our regeneration activities is around repurposing and changing places, i.e. shrinking town centres or different uses, and maybe often saying, well, there's certain people who are missing, i.e. people who no longer come to the town, or people who you'd maybe would expect to be there, but they're not there currently in terms of future regeneration, future occupants. So it's how you engage those future residents, visitors, because you often would find with a lot of regeneration projects, there's a reminiscence of how great it was in the past, a lot of our places, and actually saying, well, there needs to be a future, and the future often involves change, but that can be difficult. So there's no easy answer there, but often that's using focus groups or finding other ways of engaging. And from what Karen was saying, there a lot of seem to be using these online platforms, and that's how people are very familiar and engaging, and in their own time, in their own ways.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. Karen, this is a direct one for you. Are there direct links between the people group and the public service board? And is the work of the group reflected in the wellbeing plan? And if so, does that add value? So what's your link with the public service board?
In short, our placemaking plans outline the relationship to the work of the PSB, but also other key bodies or key plans and strategies. So, for example, how that then translates into Flintshire Council Plan. We've also got different forums that we escalate or feed things up to. So, for example, a couple of the Welsh Government North Wales colleagues sit on a forum called the Economic Collaborative Group. They're on the call today, and that's where we give an update around placemaking, about what's going on as a whole. And then there's other senior representatives from those organisations. So it does add value, but it's not just through the PSB. And yes, then links to the wellbeing plan. It's through a kind of plethora of different organisations that I probably could have mentioned as part of the presentation. But it's about aligning it to everything that we do. There's no point in just, again, having these groups and that's just contained within the group. There's links in and out. So yes, it is all pretty much aligned. And again, based on key personnel, keeping that going and propelling that, I think, as well. That's really important.
Great, thank you. I'm going to do one more question just because I'm conscious of time. There's a few questions around engagement, but we've got a future session on empowering communities, which will be very much about engaging the community. So we can probably pick up some of those themes then. I'm also seeing some around activating ground floor uses and public art. We'll try and pick those up separately, but just to come to one final one, I support the wording for good enough to approve over being bad enough to refuse. However, this needs to be built into planning policy or design SPG to hang your hat on, or does it need to be? PEDU generally don't consider design like local authorities do from experience. I think, Steve, that's probably one to you, really.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that one?
I think it's key in our, as we all go into our local development plan reviews, to make sure we've got the right hook there in terms of policy. Obviously comes down from the national level for placemaking. It's in PPW. I presume the TAN related to design will be refreshed at some point. And then we've got, in terms of SPG, we've got a range of them in Swansea, different scales of residential, shop fronts, infill development, those sorts of things. But we're doing really well with appeal. It's not just about appeals, but often where applications are refused, we're getting some, a high level of those refusals that when they go to appeal are being dismissed, with the inspector site referencing our SPGs. So if you can get strong placemaking guidelines written into your SPGs, the inspectorate respects that, would be my experience. And yeah, build your placemaking SPGs around the charter. A lot of developers these days, they themselves or agents, architects are signed up to the charter themselves. So it's always an interesting point to sort of start a discussion around a project of how the proposal responds to the charter. Really important there. But yeah, and I think it's once you've got that stall set out and people know where they stand, they tend to come to those negotiations expecting to be pushed on those things, and a good journey. And often we hear at the end, these end up being some of the most successful projects for those developers, for those investors, when they've kind of worked with us and embraced placemaking. So it shouldn't really be a battle anymore. I'd be interesting to hear more generally across Wales. It feels like there's a really positive culture change.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, sadly, that's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much for those who have joined us online and for the questions. We'll follow up and circulate this video and perhaps a note of some of the key themes and questions coming through. Just to highlight, the next one of these webinars is the 17th of October, and that's focusing on stimulating private sector investment for town centres through placemaking. We'll pop a link to that in the chat. We also, as the Design Commission for Wales, have an in-person event in North Wales, in Wrexham, on the 24th of October. That's going to be looking at a place-led future for Wales, which should be a really good conversation around the opportunities in North Wales. We'll drop a link to that as well. Do sign up and come along, because it'd be great to hear more from you. But thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you, Karen and Steve. Really helpful input today. And I've learned a lot, and hopefully others have too. So thanks to the participants, and we'll see you in the next webinar.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.